So today I'd like to talk about kind of illustrating your drawings that you get out of whatever software you're using, in our case, most likely Revit, to create some interesting illustrations. And if you look at some of the rendering styles of projects that you see kind of around the internet, and they really talk about your project in a way that is not just representative, but actually interpreting the project to be more expressive, to have more of a graphical focus, to have kind of a meta message where the drawing itself talks about your project. Now, what I've done here is kind of listed all the simplest techniques that I could come up with, and I'd like you to each try 3 of these in your rendered perspective drawing. You don't have to do each one, and obviously you can combine them in different ways. You can be as creative as you want. Starting in your project, you have to make sure you export from Revit at a decent resolution and the correct zooming. I would recommend checking your Revit viewport size. And for rendered images, cloud rendered images, obviously make sure that you have the highest quality that you can. Now, let's start and do some simple adjustments. The first one is brightness and saturation. These are things that you would typically do when you print your project and you realize, oh, it's way too dark, or the colors are just a little too aggressive. This is particularly true when you're using the realistic view out of Revit. So let's take a look at Photoshop. So here's my black and white hidden line view from Photoshop. And before I do anything else, I like to check and make sure that my image size is correct. As I have mentioned in past lectures, 200 pixels per inch is ideal, but you also want to make sure that this is as big as you plan to print it. 16 inches is a good size for our image. Now you can go ahead and place your other images on top of this one. Just choose File, Place Embedded. Okay. I have the realistic view, and I also have the rendered view. I think I'm going to just stick with the rendered view. When you bring in an object, Photoshop asks you to confirm your transformation, which is basically placing the object in your image. If you have used the same perspective composition, they should lie right on top of each other. Now, Photoshop has a number of different default workspaces. If you click on the workspace button, probably the one that you're looking at looks something like this. This is the Essentials workspace. I like to use the painting one. It keeps the layers menu up on top and has all the basic tools that we need. You can also right-click on the layers toolbar and choose the large thumbnails. This is great if you have, like me, kind of bad eyesight. What's the most basic adjustment you can do? Well, you can adjust the brightness of each of these, of this layer stack, very easily. Down at the bottom of the layers menu, there is an option to create a new adjustment layer. I'm just going to click on that little half circle or circle, and I'm going to choose a brightness contrast adjustment layer. And what happens, that pops up, and a little properties menu pops up, and then you can drag the sliders to affect the adjustment layer. And you see how it gets brighter. And this is great. My image looks fine on my screen, but I know for certain that it's going to be very dark when I print it. I also want to adjust the saturation. Now, the saturation, if you remember from color theory, is how much color is in the image. I'm just going to go click on this adjustment layer, and lo and behold, there is a hue saturation adjustment layer. The properties menu pops up, and I can drag the slider. What this will do, it will basically remove color information. If I drag it all the way over, now I have a black and white image. Sometimes a black and white image can be very effective in your project because you can really talk about different things. It's easier to discuss spatial concepts and things like that. I'm just going to lighten up the saturation so that it's not quite so colorful. I find the carpet and the yellow that I chose, the way they rendered, is a little too bold. What's nice about these layers is I can turn them on or off independently and evaluate what I think about them. And then if I want to make changes, I can just double click on the icon and it brings up the properties menu. The next very simple technique we can do is adding back in the lines into your image. When Revit renders your images, sometimes you end up when colors are very close to each other, they kind of disappear. You see how we're losing our lines there, and it's all a little mushy, frankly. We can add back in the lines. We have them. Here, I'll turn this off. This is our linework layer. I can just add those lines back into my drawing. First of all, to do that, this background layer, I can't really make any changes on it because it has a lock symbol on it. But if you double-click on the layer, it converts the locked background layer into something you can edit. And I'm just going to drag it on top of the list here. And layers in Photoshop are opaque, so it completely covers that background image. Now I could come in here and lower the opacity. See how there's this opacity slider here in the layers menu? I'll just drag that down. And that starts to reveal the base image. The problem here is that it also makes the lines less opaque. What I need to do is change what's called the blending mode. And right here it says normal. Well, I can make the blending mode, in this case, let's just choose multiply. Multiply is one of my favorites. And what it does is anything that's white in this image becomes completely clear, completely transparent. Anything that's black remains solid. And this is a great way. Now I've got all my lines back in. They're a little heavy, so I can come back in here and adjust the opacity, soften them up ever so slightly. And now I have my lines back. Let's talk about the next technique, which I like to call the oval fade. And what you can do, and it doesn't have to be oval, it can be rectilinear. But we're going to fade to line work. So here we are back in Photoshop. I want to duplicate this background layer because this change is going to be destructive. So I'm going to duplicate the layer by just right-clicking on it, and there's an option to duplicate the layer. We could name it, but I'm way too lazy to do that. And I'm going to put it back to its normal mode. So now it's white. And I'm going to put it back to 100% opaque. But what I want to do is I'm basically going to delete part of this image, okay? And what you can do, you can use any number of selection tools. The rectangular marquee, obviously, is a rectangular selection tool, but there's also an elliptical marquee tool. Let's try that one. And the way it works is you click and drag to draw the area. Once the area is drawn, you have what are known as the marching ants. Why are they known as marching ants? I don't know. But anyway, that area can be deleted. You just hit the delete button. And like magic, you have kind of a window into your project. I'm going to hit Command D to deselect. Now, you might say, I don't really like that. That's a little too aggressive. So I'm going to go and step backwards, which on a Mac is Command Alt Z. Control Alt Z is the PC command. So I have my selection again, and I'm in my marquee tool. I can right click on that selection and choose feather. Now feathering will soften this edge by some number of pixels. 75 is probably a good number for our images. 100 will be a little softer, and 25 will be less soft. I'll click OK. It doesn't really look any different, but now when I hit delete, see how it's much softer around the edges? And this can be a nice technique to kind of gently transition. What it does is focus your attention on the center of the drawing. And I happen to think this is a nice technique, but what if you want to fade from color to an image where the lines are white and the area is black, more like what you might call a vignette effect? Photoshop has an adjustment layer called invert, which will make everything opposite from what it is currently. So I'm going to just choose that. It's at the top of the list here, so remember, anything below it is affected. Now you might say, hey, whoa, there is some seriously strange stuff happening on the colored image. I want this to only affect the layer below it. To do that, hold down the Alt key, or Option on a Mac, and you see how when I move my mouse between the two layers, there's a box that faces down? I'll just click on that box to link these two layers. This effect only applies to this current layer. You see how there's a little down arrow here. I can hold down Option or Alt to undo that linking, but this is nice because now I can turn this off and the linking goes with it. It doesn't affect any layers below. The next technique makes up for yet another Revit shortcoming, which is that they don't always do lighting quite the way you want them to. There are two techniques. One uses an adjustment layer, and one uses just an area of painted white. Let's select an area that is going to be representative of what looks like a kind of cone of light. Maybe I'll use my lasso tool here. And with the lasso tool, you just click and drag to continue drawing. And what I want is for it to look like there's light coming from this light source. So I'm going to select that area. I'm going to feather it. 75 is a bit much in this case. 25 will probably get us the effect we want. The simplest thing that you can do is what we've already learned. You can create an adjustment layer. Just choose brightness contrast. What you will see, however, when you do this is you see how it just indicates that this area is white. With these adjustment layers, this is called a clipping mask, and anything that's black will be ignored. Anything that's white will have the effect that we are fiddling with. So now when I adjust my brightness, you see how it just adjusts this one area. It's generally not as strong as some other techniques, but it is actually quite effective. So another way to use that same selection, and I'm just going to go to Select, Reselect, to bring back that area. Another technique that also works well is to fill this area with white and then fiddle around with blending modes and opacity. The way you fill these is you select the area you want, and I like to make a new layer down here on my layers menu. There's a new layer button, so I have a nice blank slate to work with. And then I'm going to go to Edit, Fill, or Shift F5, and I can fill that area with any number of things. I can fill it with black, I can fill it with white, I can even do colors or patterns, but I'm just going to choose white for now. All right, and normal blending mode, 100% opaque, click OK. And you might say, okay, that doesn't look so sporty now, does it? Well, first of all, you can fiddle around with the opacity and get a very similar effect. Yeah, it's still a little bit too much for me. Another thing you can do is change the blending modes. Green works pretty well sometimes. And again, adjust the opacity to see. It doesn't look all that different actually with screen. There are some other effects, but again, a lot of these effects are going to affect colors in unpredictable ways. The soft light is generally pretty good, but if you use, say, vivid light, you're going to start to see some unusual effects in the colors, although this doesn't look too bad. The next technique is also a simple technique, but can get you some real dynamic compositional elements, and I like to call it aggressive cropping. For this technique, you basically want to hide parts of the drawing to emphasize one element or another. So for example, I like these beams. I like the way they kind of stick out. To graphically emphasize that, maybe I'm going to hide parts of the ceiling here. Now, the way to do that, you can use any of the selection tools that we've discussed so far, the marquees, the lassos. I'm going to try the quick selection tool. And the way that works is you kind of wipe over an area and it tries to guess what area you want. The reason that this works is because it's guessing based on color and sort of contiguousness of the area. I have this button up here selected. It's called the Sample All Layers button. You can modify just the current layer by unchecking that button. You can also change the size of the selector. You can also add to this selection using the other tools. You just have to remember to hold down Shift, and you see how my cursor changes to have a little plus sign. So if I say want to add in, oh, I don't know, I'm going to just chop off parts of this wall here. There we go. So the easiest way to take advantage of this selection area is to fill it with white. So I'll just call up, well, I'll create a new layer called Aggressive Cropping. And then I'll call up my fill menu and just fill the selection area with white. The nice thing about this, first of all, it allows me to turn off the effect if I'm not sure that I like it. Also, you can use other tools, including something like the paintbrush. You can paint areas that maybe you want to soften. For example, first of all, make sure that the color you're painting is white. Right now it's painting black. I can just swap the colors here. It always paints the one that's in the foreground. And let's say I want to, I don't know, just create kind of an area area that is a little softer along the bottom, I can just come in here and draw that area. Obviously, you could feather these selections as well. Our next effect that we're going to try, I like to call it the layered fade. And this is destructive, and you can do it either by modifying the rendered layer, or I'll show you, you can use the black and white layer as well. So the way that this technique works is obviously you need your layer back, your black and white layer back in normal mode, and you select a rectangle, okay, and maybe this center area is going to be more colorful. And you just delete it, as we did before. But now, select another rectangle, and I'm going to make it a little uneven just for style. And rather than delete it, I'm going to right-click on the selection and choose Layer via Cut. And what this will do, this creates a whole new layer with just that selected piece on it. And what's fun about that is now I can modify the opacity of that layer, and this gives me sort of an interesting kind of, I don't know, almost a zooming effect. Again, it's emphasizing the center of the drawing. The next technique is an awful lot of fun, not for everybody, and it is a destructive technique. It's using Photoshop's filters to create a more artsy look. So the way this particular technique works is there's a whole filter gallery that you can look at. And filters modify the drawing to have different effects. And a lot of these are very artistic. Some of them just kind of add a touch of texture on top. And you can modify each of these by just changing the sliders in the tool. Each one is going to work ever so slightly differently depending on what the background image is, what the coloration is. And so use your preview window. You can even pan around in the preview window and zoom in and out to see how much you like that effect. So in this case, you can see that it softens the image quite a bit. And I'm going to just click OK. Because I have copied the background layer, right, here's my original layer, you can decide if you like it or not, but you can also blend it with the other layer. Usually this is done with opacity. You can see how it just kind of softens the image ever so slightly. You can also combine it with some of the fading techniques that we've learned earlier. The next technique is to add what commonly called noise or visual noise. That works in a very similar way, except that you turn your filtered layer that we created in the last option, you turn it black and white. So one that I like to use for this effect is the film grain layer. I would encourage you, by the way, there are many other types of layers here, splatter, sprayed strokes. There are also kind of sketchy ones. A lot of these are going to produce some really interesting effects. I'm just going to use this one because I just want a little bit of texture on my drawing. I'll click OK. Like we did before, just choose an adjustment layer. In this case, I'm going to choose a black and white adjustment layer. See how it pops in above this one. Now I can link the two layers like we did before. Hold down Alt. So it just affects that one adjusted layer. And finally, I can change the blending mode to multiply so that anything that is black will be opaque and anything that is white will remain. So you will need to select the layers that you created and make sure that you adjust how opaque they are to get a nice look. But what this does is it gives you just an ever so slight amount of texture. Obviously, in the real world, nothing is completely smooth, and so you get a nice kind of softness to the image that wasn't there when we didn't have that effect. So this next effect gives you a sense of depth in the space, kind of brings your eye forward, and it's blurring the depth, the deep part of your project. So with this one, very similar to what we did before, you're probably going to want to select an area using any of the selection tools that are convenient for your particular composition. I'm going to just lasso here, and I want to basically select kind of the back of the space. You can also go around people, for example, and anything in the foreground. And then you can also feather that selection. So I'll feather it. And this probably calls for a pretty big feather, 75. The other thing is that you can use a technique like if you want this column to appear to be very sharp, you can deselect the column by just holding down the Alt button. Okay, remove that from the selection. And just so you can see what's going on the copy of my layer, I'll hit delete. Now we have the area selected. You can continue to add to it, but I'm just going to go to my filter menu. And there is a whole blurry area of different kinds of blurs you can do. I like Gaussian blur, but what you can see is that it's kind of obscuring the area in the background. And click deselect, and there we go. You end up with kind of a blurry effect in the background. Now, this is more apparent when you have more materials available in that are kind of textured. Obviously, the reflective materials are affected, so you might want to deselect anything reflective, and that creates kind of an interesting effect. What this tends to do is draw your eye forward in the space. All right, the next effect is another fun one. This makes up for the fact that sometimes Revit doesn't get its lighting right. But this one is a little more destructive than what we learned earlier. So be sure that you copy your background layer. So the way this filter works is, again, you copy your background layer, go to the filter gallery, render, lighting effects. And Photoshop has built into it a bunch of basically kind of different kinds of lights. Here's a spotlight. We can make it a point light or an infinite light. There are also presets. If you look at some of these presets, they are pretty handy. 5 lights down emulates down lights, 3 lights down, or spotlights. But I'm just going to stick with this one for now. Lighting has a couple of different kind of adjusters on them. First of all, you can click and drag the centerpiece of the light, adjust its location. You can also adjust the beam spread by just clicking and dragging. You can also use other grips to adjust the length. Here, let me zoom out a little. And finally, you can change the rotation and the width of this light source, again, just by modifying some of these basic features. And I'm going to just drag it over here so that it vaguely looks like there's light coming out of that light source, okay, on the location here in my project. You can also change a number of other features. For example, in this properties dialog box, there's something called ambience. If you drag it over, you see how it gets much darker in the rest of the image. So often we want it not to be quite so dramatic. There are other effects. You can make things look more glossy, colorized. You can have a bigger or smaller hotspot to the light source, just again, depending on the effect that you want. Finally, when you click OK, it will apply it to that background layer. Now, all of my layers, I didn't rasterize this particular layer, so the filter is, you do have the ability to turn it off. Just a fair warning, if you have rasterized your layer, that effect will be permanent. You can't undo it. So again, this is why I often place all the layers into my project, starting with the black and white layer, because you do the sort of least amount of damage to the black and white layer. So the next technique that I recommend is what I call situationally appropriate scale figures, which is to say figures that are doing what they are supposed to be doing in your space. Obviously, in our case, it's a gallery. You probably want to find people that are going to be looking at the pictures. So the easiest thing to do is look for people with an alpha channel. You can usually find pretty decent images with that alpha channel. So I recommend this search. And the big thing is when you adjust them in your drawing, make sure that their eye heights match any eye heights in the drawing already. If you don't have any people in the drawing, which is sometimes a nice way to start, put their eyes at the horizon line. I am using Bing, which is another search engine, but you can use any one you want. Google, obviously, Dogpile, whatever it is. However, Bing has the advantage of when you click on an image, the image pops open in a new window. Google was sued, and it doesn't allow you to do that. So anyway, get that image and save it onto your computer. So here I've placed the image into my computer, and there's a number of different things that you can do when you bring it in. For example, one technique that's kind of fun to do is make it appear like there's a person in the foreground. Again, you just want them to seem like they're in the right spot. I want to match the eye height of somebody standing. Maybe this guy is looking at the white rabbit. And these pictures come in as their own layer, so you can duplicate them. The big thing is make sure when you resize these people that you resize them by holding down Shift. It locks the proportion. And then it's just a matter of making sure their eye heights match. and then placing them in a location which makes sense in your project. Standing on the stairs. Whoa, he's falling off the stairs. And again, situationally appropriate. Is this what somebody looks like when they're going up the stairs or not? And are they in the background, foreground, or middle ground? I would strongly recommend that you have at least 3 scale figures in all of your drawings, kind of always. It just really helps to understand your projects. And don't forget that we also have an ArchVision subscription on the desktops. To make this work with Photoshop, you just click the preview button over here that allows you to choose an item. There are a lot of people. This particular library, what's nice about that, you can find somebody who kind of makes sense in your project. If you want someone looking up, you can just choose somebody who's looking up, and you can even aim them in the right direction. Say, oh, they're looking at a painting over there. You see how there's even a light source. Just choose render, and what it will do is you'll now have an image that you can drag, just click and drag it into your Photoshop version. If you don't feel like going over and getting your file on the PCs, you can also just drag the image onto the desktop. That's what I did here. And you can see that it saves it as a PNG file. You can then email that to yourself, and you don't even need to have ArchVision on your computer. All right, the next technique is one that people commonly do, but is to put a cityscape outside of your window. Of course, get an image, first of all, that is situationally appropriate, correct street, the correct time of day. And then you're going to want to match the kind of eye height of the photographer with your eye height in the drawing. And you're going to want to make sure that the perspective matches as well. So here's a view of Newbury Street that I downloaded, and I think I'm going to make it appear as if this was a window instead of just a view of the White Rabbit. And the easiest way to do this is to create a clipping mask that clips away this particular image so that all you can see is what you're kind of interested in. I'm going to draw the selection area using a polygonal lasso. Okay. Try to be as precise as possible. So I've got my area selected here, and I've got my view of Newbury Street. And what I want to do is basically create a mask around this area so that all I see through it is this streetscape. I'm going to use what's called a clipping mask. And you do that by creating a new adjustment layer. I'm going to use brightness contrast. And if you remember from previous lessons, it will just adjust that area. I'm not even going to change the brightness. But what I am going to do is I'm going to link these 2 layers. Now the trick here is the order of the layers. If I drag this layer up above the adjustment layer and then link the 2 of them together, what it will do is it will crop away anything that isn't in this white area. Now my image is still there, so I can come in with my move tool and move the image in, and you see how it shows up through the window. Yay! And I can do all sorts of adjusting to that image to make it appear to be in the right location. First of all, getting the eye height. Here's a person here out on the street, conveniently with eyes. I can drag them up so that their eyes are at the correct height. Obviously, if the street level's a little below, you would drag it down, which in Newbury Street it typically is, or put it up high, whatever. The other thing is, you can see how the perspective is a little bit off. I have vanishing points. I have a third vanishing point. Well, I can modify this image using a special tool called Transform. And there are a number of different transform tools. Each of them has kind of its own little special flavors. But Distort basically allows you to grab individual corners or center points of the image and kind of stretch it out. You see how I can drag this so that it's all like warped? You can also kind of force the perspective a little bit by dragging things in. And if the objects are off, you can really kind of warp the whole thing. Anyway, commit to the transformation. And there you go. You have your view out the window. We could absolutely change the opacity of the layer so it's not so bright. You don't want people focused outside of your window. I would also recommend, if you're doing this technique, to modify the image in a couple of other ways. First of all, I like to give it ever so slight a blur and to make it black and white. First of all, go to the filter menu, blur, and let's try motion blur in this case. And again, you can fiddle with the blurriness. That kind of makes my eyes cross, but a little bit less is probably okay. And then you can also put in an adjustment layer. I'm going to make this, what am I going to do with this one? We'll make it black and white. Okay. Again, link those two layers by using the Alt tool. And that, and what that does compositionally, it kind of makes it a little less distracting from the rest of the drawing. Okay, you don't want people looking out the window. Finally, you can fiddle around with the opacity if you don't have anything beyond it. And there you go. You can get any number of effects that way. But this is a great way to make it appear like there's something outside your window. The last technique that I'll show you is adding in things like plants and foliage. Again, this is entourage. It tends to liven up the space, make it look a little more, lived in. And like before, you just want to search for an image that has an alpha channel that's hopefully a PNG file. Place it in your project. But now we'll learn one more technique where we add some layer styles. So you can see here I've got some vines that have some transparency to them. You can create these yourself using Photoshop, but obviously searching and finding an image that's the right size and the right transparency makes the most sense. So I can put this here on this front desk to make it look like the vines are kind of, hanging off the front desk. But I want it to look like it's a little more wedded into the drawing. The easiest way to do that is with what's called a layer style. And you just go to Layer, Layer Style, and Drop Shadow is our little friend in this location. Choose Drop Shadow. Let me pull this menu off to the side here. This Layer Styles menu, there are a number of different great features, but Drop Shadow, you just have to make sure it's selected so that you can modify it. First of all, you can change the direction of the shadow. I'm going to make this really dark so that you can see it a little better. As you change the direction, the shadow goes in different angles. Obviously, it wants to match the lighting in your space. You can control a number of other things, including the spread, the size. That'll get you a little more softer shadows. Also how far the shadows go. So there's any number of different features that you can add to it, but I'll just click OK. And what's nice is that if you have more than one, if I were to copy this, those shadows and all the other settings are repeated. All right, I think one is plenty for our space. Now, the other part that I want you all to do is to render your floor plans to kind of illustrate them. And again, these are real simple techniques to create kind of partial floor plans or partially rendered floor plans. These are all techniques which we've actually already learned, drawing white areas to crop the sheet. The only thing we haven't learned is how to draw lines, and also a technique for rendering just a swath of your floor plan, or the corners if you prefer. So here's my beautiful rendered floor plan, rendered on the cloud using the section box. And obviously that's like way too red. That is going to be frightening if it's on my board. So you can use one of those hue saturation adjustment layers or brightness layers to affect it. Now, I also want the lines back in here. So like we did before, I'll create black and white, a hidden line layer, and then make it the multiply adjustment, layer blending mode. Then I'm going to add in some white area to crop away the plan. And again, I just created a new layer, drew a box that's white, because in our project, you don't want to see any part of the plan that is not in your Revit redo image. And a lot of you, I think, only built part of your project, and that's fine. The trick here is that you want to put in a cut line. I'll just show you the one that I put in here. That's a line, right, that I just drew in Photoshop. The way that you draw these lines, first of all, make yourself a new layer so that you can turn the thing on and off, and then you can use either the brush tool or the pencil tool. I'm going to draw a cut line for these stairs so that you know that they are not continuing up. Just be aware that when you draw, like with our other programs that we've been using, there are different kinds of brushes. Obviously, a solid brush probably makes sense in our setting here, and the diameter of it can be modified as well. Now, when you draw, it will draw the foreground color, so make sure that you select the foreground color. Black is fine. And then if you hold down Shift while you're drawing, it will draw a straight line. If you stop clicking, but you keep holding down Shift and just click, and I'm just clicking now, it will connect those lines in straight lines. And then I'm just going to continue to hold down Shift to get straight lines. All right, and there's many different ways to draw lines, but this is the easiest one. And what's nice, you can turn it on and off. You can lower its opacity if it looks a little aggressive in your floor plan. Now, the last thing I will show you that is kind of fun is what if you forgot to put in something in your plan, like a bench or something like that. It's a really simple way to put in a bench. And you can always go back to Revit and re-render, and it takes forever. Sometimes you just want to stick something in there, window frame or something like that. Select an area where you think the bench should go. Once you have the area selected, you can create a new layer that is a pattern layer. And why would you want to do this? Well, Photoshop has a number of different patterns in it. Wood, leather, all sorts of terrific stuff. And these are great ways to kind of gussy up your floor plan. What's nice is it makes it really easy to change the scale of the pattern to kind of match the size of your drawing. See how I can make the tile, pretty close to what might be a realistic size. Click OK. Now, that doesn't really look all that terrific now, does it? But remember we learned about those layer styles. I'll just double-click on my layer to bring up the layer style menu. And you can fiddle around with a number of these features, but bevel and emboss is a great one to kind of get you an edge. And again, you can fiddle around with how much the bevel goes in or out, the size of the bevel. Again, you can kind of make things look more like cushions just by these real simple techniques. And I'll turn on a drop shadow, and we'll just leave it at that, maybe a little less opaque so it matches the other shadows. And there you go, an instant bench where there was none before. One last technique for the floor plan is to render kind of just a swath of the plan. The way that you do this is you select an area. Let's see, I'll use a polygonal lasso here, and I'll just draw across the plan. Okay, and this will be the swath that gets rendered. You want to feather that, and again, depending on the resolution of your project, the feathering amount will be different. I want to leave the walls in there so that my poche, oops, I'm holding down the wrong button, Alt removes from the selection. Okay, there we go. And that ought to give me a nice clean look. So once you have the area selected, just go down to your layer that needs to be cropped and click the Add Layer Mask button. And it will crop away the rest of your project. So as a reminder, you basically have two things that you need to do. One is take your perspective drawing and apply at least 3 of these techniques to it to give it kind of illustration quality. And then do the similar thing to your floor plan. Make sure that it's lightened up a little bit, not quite so irritating, and that you crop away the parts of the plan that you don't want to see.